Welcome back to Notes and Things, a podcast about ideas worth pausing for. I'm your host, Eric Verdine. What happens to your view of the world when you stop experiencing it through headlines and start encountering it person by person? Today's guest is Charlie Walker, an explorer and writer who has traveled roughly 60,000 miles under his own power across some of the most remote parts of the world. His journeys have taken him by bicycle, foot, ski, kayak, and dugout canoe. From the Tibetan Plateau in Central Africa to the frozen reaches of Siberia, all the while learning from the people he's encountered. He's truly an expert observer of humanity. His latest book, On Thin Ice, chronicles a journey through Russia that began as an expedition and ended with surveillance, arrest, and imprisonment as Russia invaded Ukraine. We talk about adventure and endurance, the remarkable kindness of strangers, risk and fear, patriotism and authoritarianism, and what years spent crossing cultures have taught Charlie about people. Let's jump in. All right, Charlie, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast today for a great conversation. I was super looking forward to this. I kind of encountered you reading your books about when you traveled for over 4 years. And is it 60,000 miles on foot? From
43, I'm afraid.
43,000.
Well, 60,000 by various means of transport, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And which is absolutely astounding. And I've been blessed with the opportunity of being able to travel when I was in school and, in my adult life and different careers. And in those experiences, you encounter different peoples and cultures and situations. But for what I did, it pales in comparison for what you did, and certainly for most people in the world. And when I was trying to prepare this talk, I go, man, there's so many different things to talk about. And what popped up for me today, well, I thought of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, where it takes 10,000 hours for someone to become a world expert at something. And then I thought of you as that you've become an expert in observation of humanity in all of your travels, whether I suppose you intended to or not. What is it that you kind of set out for when you first began your travels, and how has that evolved for you over time?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you on Notes and Things. I think the reasons that I initially set out traveling and the reasons that I travel today are the same, but have probably altered in sort of ratio. I think when I first started doing this, I was looking for an escape to the wider world. I grew up in a very small rural community, and I knew the world was big, varied, interesting place, and I wanted to get out and see lots and lots of it. And I wanted to stretch myself. I had a very sort of sheltered and comfortable upbringing, and I suppose I felt I'd never been especially tested. So I was looking to kind of pit myself against hardship, or looking to sort of insert some road bumps into my life. And I was always just fascinated about different people, different parts of the world, how people live, how their lives vary from mine or from ours here in the West, for example. And gradually over the years, that second aspect has swollen, and the first aspect of wanting to test myself has diminished to some extent, I suppose, because I now have a better idea of what I'm capable of. And I'm not someone who is necessarily seeking records and seeking to pioneer at the extremes or anything like that. I just like to go to places that are different and difficult. So now, sort of referring back to the beginning of your question, I suppose to some extent I like to see myself as a witness of other communities, other cultures, other ways of living. And if I can physically and mentally test myself in the process of reaching, for example, an isolated community, then so much the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about your writing style the most is how much you integrate history and background into the travels that you're experiencing in the moment. When you are looking to go to a particular area, how much are you researching prior, kind of outside of just, tactical itinerary, et cetera, things to look out for, but really digging into the history, because there's so much there, right?
Yeah, I mean, history, it's funny, we have this term, this category, this sort of genre of study, history. For history encompasses absolutely everything. History encompasses culture, how a culture came to be, conflict, nature, environment, technology. History is really the story of all of us at all times throughout all of human history and then prehistory. So how I research things, that's different for different journeys. Sometimes I have more time. Sometimes there's more information available. The way I tend to go about it is just reading as much as I can, be that books or articles or, I mean, on a surface level, when you get started, dipping into some Wikipedia pages and following those links and going down the rabbit holes and then going down to the notes at the bottom and finding out where that information came from and finding out, reading some of that and finding that whoever transcribed it to Wikipedia went way off track and it might not be that accurate. But really, it's a sort of a multifaceted sense of trying to, also listening to radio documentaries, watching documentaries, TV, films, literature from that area, anything and everything I can find, really, limited largely by time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how you described history as encompassing all of these different areas of study. And, when I think of history as well, when you're visiting a place, we often think, okay, what happened in the past 10 years, the past 20 years, the past 50 years? But really, when you're looking at how a people have developed over time, particularly a society or a culture, you're looking at hundreds, thousands of years. So how far back do you try to think about how far you should study?
I mean, the sky's the limit, I guess. I'm not someone who is particularly doing, from a historical perspective, primary research. I'm not. I'm a generalist, I guess. So when I go somewhere, what I'm learning about depends on what people there already know, or what people who have visited there have already written or researched or discovered or surmised about that place and that place's history or a people's history. And so there's no aspect of it that I don't find interesting. But obviously, for want of a better word, scholarship doesn't cover everything always everywhere you go. So you've got what you've got, and you make do with it.
Absolutely. Coming back to what you were kind of setting out for before, over your time, what has surprised you most about what you've discovered about humanity, or what you believed other peoples were like prior to, maybe perhaps preconceived notions? What has surprised you?
The obvious answer to that is, and it's sort of a cliche, but the kindness of people, the kindness of strangers, human kindness. And it's funny because this is a term, the kindness of strangers, that we're pretty familiar with these days. And I think most of us, whether we want to or not, probably perhaps even on a subconscious level, have some caveats to our understanding or our acceptance of that. For strangers, of course, people are kind, but there are limits, or this won't be the same in X, Y, and Z places because they've had a very difficult history, or because whatever it might be. And the big thing I've discovered really is that latter thing is not really true. It doesn't really matter where you go. People are generally good and kind and helpful, and I've found that to be as much, if not more, so the case in places that, on the face of things, you might think wouldn't be. For example, Iran or Afghanistan, or places that have trouble. But and generally, and this is another sort of cliche that I think most of us will have heard and sort of vaguely understand, but might not really, on a deeper level, believe to be true. People who have less share more, and are certainly more willing to share more freely and generously of what they have.
Why do you think that is?
I'm sure there are very interesting studies and theses written about
sure,
this.
But your personal experience, yeah.
My personal impression would be that possessions promote acquisitiveness. And the more we have, the more we think we have something to protect or defend. I think it's also true often, not universally, not of all places and not of all people in particular places, but generally I think people who have more often think they have done more to gain that and deserve it more, and therefore it's theirs and are more likely to hang on to it. It's a slightly uncomfortable generalization, but I think there's something to it.
I think there's a lot of fairness in that. That was another one of the themes that had come up in my mind to discuss with you, because when you read your travels, and I recommend for everybody listening to pick up your books and listen to them, because it can incredibly eye-opening about different cultures and people, but is this how willing people who were in abject poverty compared to Western standards were bringing you in and sharing their food, even if it was some of the last bits that they had. And it was beautiful to see, particularly in areas, just like you said, where we have, for so many variety of reasons, an aversion to saying, oh, I'd go there. And that was just beautiful to see. And I think that you're right. When I was thinking about this, people who are not wanting don't know what it's like when they're on the edge and they need something to survive. And when they're seeing this foreigner going and they say, I want to make, this is life is a real thing. These negative things can happen. I want to help protect them. It's just a whole nother level of living, right, and surviving.
Yeah, I mean, I think the recurring theme you often come up against or come to in discussions on this topic is the difference between more and less wealthy areas, parts of the world, countries, neighborhoods, etc. And I think a big part of that is that in the West, a slightly lazy term, but I'll use it now. Mm-hmm. In the West, we have developed a society where we tend to live our lives in private. Mm-hmm. We have quite siloed existences. And of course, we don't remain in bunkers and never go out. But what I mean by that is we go home, we open our front door, we step in, we close that front door, and then that's kind of us, we're in. And we don't as often sit out on the street and watch the world go by, or, just sit beside a road and chat to people as they pass, or, we're very, very busy. We're very focused on our individual goals and dreams, but also our individual prosperity. And I think understandably in that and in the competitiveness that engenders, we often lose sight of the simpler, bigger picture. I'm not condemning that by any means. I think that competitiveness, that drive to pioneer, to expand, has led to, as well as many bad things historically, many, many fascinating, important, useful things, vaccines and technologies that have lifted human immiseration sort of beyond what could have been imagined, let's say, just 100 years ago. But it does involve us shutting the world out to some extent, I think. And I have found that people even in my country, in the UK, they still hold that kernel of kindness. People still want to help. If you get knocked off your bike on a street in London, you you will, provided there are people there, you will immediately be surrounded by people trying to help you out, trying to, let me help you into this pub where there'll be a first aid kit or whatever. People want to help. People go out of their way. People look for opportunities to help. The number of people in Western societies who volunteer is extremely high as well. It's just that because of the siloing of our lives, we don't often see people in distress viscerally in person near us. We see that, I suppose you could say, academically reported through news. There is X amount of homelessness, there is X amount of child poverty, and there's a remove there. Some studies by various charities, I think, found years ago that if you showed let's say an advert for Oxfam on TV, with one starving child, and if you show the same audience an advert with 100 starving children, or figures that amount to that, they give more to the first one because it's more graspable, it's more visceral, it's more in your face. You can understand that one child. You can think about the lived experience of that one child. When it's 100, there's a sort of a paralysis, and you can't relate to that in the same way, because then it becomes a statistic rather than a person. I realize I veered wildly off topic there, but
no, please, rabbit holes are always welcome. And the thing that kept coming to mind is, what is community really, and how is community manifested in our lives? We have become very individual. Well, at least particularly people in the U.S., where the individual mentality and the drive for just single success is paramount to a degree that leaves a lot of those around us, instead of almost growing together. We're just like, I just want to focus on my one thing. And I would imagine that at scale, that's how countries become more isolationist. That's how they stop wanting to partner, because it's this individual drive, but they've totally forgotten how human others are. One of the one of the times that this really highlighted for me is I studied Arabic, and this was kind of the height of the Iraq War, and I went to Syria, and at the time, we didn't have great relations with Syria, and people were like, don't go to Syria. And it happened to be one of the friendliest countries I've ever visited. And it was very eye-opening to see this, like, oh my gosh, no, we're all in this together. There was really a sense of oneness there. And one of the kind of questions that came up in chatting with you is this idea of, does travel make someone more or less kind of patriotic for their homeland?
That's a great question. And the simple answer is both, I think. I think it makes you... No, I'll qualify that. Perhaps not both. I think it probably makes you... I don't know. I can only speak to my own experience.
Yeah.
I think it has made me less patriotic. I think I, in my early 20s, set out into the world with a probably quite naive view of the world, of my country, of my country's place in the world, of my country's historical role in many parts of the world. And I think the more I traveled, the more the sort of scales fell from my eyes on that front. And the more I came to be wary of, just nationalism, which nationalism and patriotism there's a blurred line. They're pretty indivisible, I think. That said, the more I traveled, the more I saw other parts of the world, other ways of living, other societies, different societal structures. We were speaking a minute ago more on the individual level within the community and the things we can learn from the rest of the world. But on a more macro scale, not that any country is perfect, least of all my own. on the more macro scale, the more I feel some element of pride, or probably more belonging than pride, really, with how the society in my country has structured and ordered itself. And I mean, frankly, the direction of travel maybe isn't great right now, but the fact that the disadvantaged in society are, at least to some extent, looked after, provided for, or just even thought of in the first place, which is not the case in a lot of the world. So I think the more I've traveled, the more I have felt happily like the product of the nation I was born in, which I am. I was educated here, and my formative years were all spent in the UK. And yet the less I have felt some sort of unexamined blanket sense of patriotism. I think that patriotism can often skew towards a feeling of superiority. So I limit my patriotism to when sports is being played, and beyond that, I try to leave it to one side.
Love that. Yeah, the when you say both, I think that there's so much nuance to it. And when we look at self-reflection, it's never one side or the other. And, we can develop an appreciation for what we've had at home when we go to a place that we haven't been, right? For you in particular, there's a lot of physical things that you've put yourself through to, in your journey, that I'm sure helps you appreciate the things that you have at home, or the simple luxuries of life. Kind of turning to that direction, a lot of the things that you've done have been incredibly physically arduous. So I'm big into running, and I saw that you did an ultra, the UMTB, not too long ago, right? Which is pretty awesome. What drives you, or would you say others, to look into what the limit is physically?
That's a difficult question, because I think many people, myself included, might have different answers to that on different days. And also with regard to any particular physical journey or challenge or exertion, you'd probably have a different answer at varying distances from having experienced or completed something, as the memory starts to rose tint. I think if we just stay within the hackneyed old phrase is the comfort zone. If we stay within our comfort zone, we limit ourselves, we limit our horizons, and whether that's physical or psychological, that it both are a problem. You don't want to be limited. You want to explore life's rich tapestry, and a big part of that is your body. To qualify, for those of us who are fortunate enough to have a fully or relatively fully working body, that's the best tool you're ever going to get. That is your means to move, to explore, to feel, to find, to get around, and I think that's, I feel it would be a shame to waste that gift. And I suppose I'm, like many before me, I'm curious to see what it can do. Where are as I said earlier, I'm not someone who explores the limits of human endurance. That's never been my thing. But I liked, for example, you mentioned an ultramarathon recently. I liked discovering that I can run 2 marathons in the mountains in a single day. Within a single 24-hour period. I definitely went past midnight into the next day. And, you feel awful afterwards, and then you feel great afterwards, or perhaps you feel awful at the time and then great afterwards, or once you finally had some sleep. The things that we do that are hardest and most exhausting are usually the things that we look back on with the warmest sense. You feel proud or satisfied, and those are, I think, priceless emotions.
You say cold, and it reminds me of your most recent book when you went to explore Siberia, and you were, pulling skis in the middle of nowhere at night in 50 degrees below zero. Um, in those moments when you're totally isolated, totally alone, but you know that you physically have to continue. What are you pulling from? What are you thinking about? What's motivating you? Is it just, I have to do this or else I'm, not going to go on any longer?
Yeah, the sort of times that you've alluded to there are maybe counterintuitively, those are the easiest times, I think, to find the resolve, the reserve, the motivation, because you have to, as you said. The times where it's harder to motivate yourself is when there's an easy out, and consequently, maybe the hardest thing to do is just to start in the first place. The doorstep mile, as some people call it, that first mile of any journey is always the hardest, because there are always 1,000 reasons why not to do something, and often it's hard to find rational reasons why to do something, because on the face of it, you're giving up comfort and safety and ample, sustenance and company to go off and suffer somewhere and take risks. So yeah, when I'm in the middle of nowhere and I'm flagging and suffering, the motivation is I've got to keep going, otherwise I'm stuck here. I think the journeys I've done in recent years where I've been hiking or kayaking have been, from that perspective, psychologically easier, because you've got to keep going. You're in the middle of nowhere. Whereas the journeys I did, the 4 years I spent cycling around Asia and Africa, that was more a mental test, I think, of my commitment or my dedication, because mostly there I was on roads, and roads usually have vehicles. So at any given point, and I was offered almost daily a lift, at any given point, someone is there, happy to, asking to give you a ride, get you out of there, take you away, stop the suffering, make everything easy. And there were times where I found that a lot harder to refuse than at others.
Mm-hmm. Through that 4-year journey, did you find it easier to say no over time, or was it a constant battle that never really went away?
It was easier at the beginning, I think, because I think I would have been ashamed of myself if I, just a few weeks in had already started taking shortcuts or something like that. There are times later where, there were times where I did seek or accept help because visa constraints or just I got stuck in unspeakably churned roads in the monsoon when I was in the north of the Republic of Congo and the southeast of Cameroon, and the roads were just churned into this insane quagmire of sort of shin deep, cloying, clay-like sucking mud. There was no tarmac anywhere. It was obviously just mud tracks through the jungle in unspeakable downpours. And after a day and a half, perhaps, of walking backwards and forwards, portaging my gear, I did finally accept a bit of help and a lift from a vehicle that seemed to somehow be managing to move. And I got a lift for 30 miles or something like that, which I have no regrets or no problem with that. There are some times where you'd just be sort of it just wouldn't make sense to carry on. But then there are other times where I was able to keep going and I was offered lifts, and the very, very end of my journey, I was cycling for the second time across the Sahara Desert. But the first time I was cycling south with the wind pushing me across Sudan. The second time I was cycling north on my way back to Europe with a ferocious headwind, this same wind, the northerly wind that sort of blows across the Sahara. And this ferocious headwind was just pummeling me. And I was cycling slower than walking pace for hours a day. And then I figured out the wind's a bit less at night, so I would wake up at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, cycle until midday. But still, I was going little faster than walking pace. And I did this for weeks, and I was offered lifts, and I refused because I felt like if I've got this far, I am still moving. I'm not at a standstill. Then I probably should just stick it out. And on that occasion, I did. So I guess there's no hard and fast rule, really. But help is always going to be offered. It needn't always be taken, I guess.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, so there's a degree of obviously practicalities and the line between does this make sense or does it not? You know, when you're trudging through knee-deep mud, it's like, you know what, this just doesn't make sense to a degree. When it comes to when people think, particularly those who haven't had the opportunity to travel outside of their home, there's a fear of danger. Part of it is the unknown. Part of it is what they see, on the news. How did you distinguish, okay, am I in a situation that I can not necessarily control, but it's safe to move forward, or I'm entering this place that is quite dangerous? What should I do? And you kind of teased this out when you were in Siberia, and you were saying, okay, the Ukraine war just broke out. What do I do? How do you think about that when you're in these different countries, these different places?
Well, I suppose the first thing there is to take what you hear, generally speaking, with a heavy pinch of salt. When I was back on my bike trip, just about every country I visited, people were warning me about the country next door. So when I was in Poland, they said, oh, watch out for those Slovakians. And the Slovakians said, be careful of those Hungarians. They are nuts. And the Hungarians said, watch out, those Romanians, they'll rob you blind. And the Romanians said, Turkey is a crazy place. And the Turks said, Iran is it's just, you shouldn't go to Iran. And of course, we fear. I suppose that's been part of human survival for millennia. And you can't take all that advice because you'd never do anything or go anywhere. With regards to fear and I suppose risk, when I was younger, I had a very cavalier approach to these things. I just charged out. I was pretty foolhardy. And, I got myself in trouble a lot of times, very rarely with people, more often with the elements. But as life's gone on, as I've got a little older, a little more experienced, hopefully a little wiser, I've got better, I believe, at calculating risk. And I think taking risks is absolutely fine. I definitely wouldn't discourage people from taking risks. I would probably advocate for hopefully knowing what those risks are, to some extent at least. There's that. People talk about the knowns, the unknowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And that latter category in exploration, could present some problems. I think it's worth working out what the problems might be. And then you've perhaps got some idea, or they're not totally unexpected, how you can deal with them. But not doing things just because something may go wrong. I'm not a big fan of that because things always go wrong. Things are always going to go wrong. And 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, you'll figure out how to solve that problem, how to get through it, how to get past it. There's very rarely things that leave you sort of weaker rather than stronger. Actually, I met an older gentleman shortly before I started traveling in my 20s, and I was he asked me what I was doing, and I explained I'm off on this big 4-year journey. I'm going to go and cycle everywhere. And he said, that sounds fantastic. Have an excellent time. Don't worry about dying. Just try not to get maimed. That was his advice. And I thought it was quite good advice. So far, I've managed to hold to that. Yeah,
that's really funny. And honestly, quite true, right? Because some things are definitely worse than death. And it too, to an extent. We can go down a rabbit hole with that. But I like your phrase of the unknown unknowns. That is really interesting. And because we've learned we often look back on the past and say the past can help dictate the future, or you can predict the future from the past. But the fact of the matter is that there is no time like today or tomorrow that has ever existed in human history. So we can do as much research as we want, but things continually change. Even, day to day, year to year, things are continually changing. So when you're traveling to a certain place and, you read the history of it and you ask people about it, the fact is that something can go sideways that has never in history happened in that place. And you just have to roll with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think life's always going to be full of surprises. And the more surprising, I suppose, the more formative.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying in your younger years, you went in a foolhardy way, now being a bit wiser. But there is a massive journey in that. And it can be a vacillation between, I'm just going to go all out, the throttle's down, and then you go, I need to pull back a little bit. What were the moments, in your first journey where maybe you go, you know what, I pushed too hard there. And then you pulled back. And then what was that going back into saying, well, I'm going to push a little bit more again?
Yeah, I suppose any time that genuinely scared me. I don't scare massively easily, and probably less easily now than formerly. But the first big moment, I think, was about 6 months into that journey, crossing Tibet. And I cycled up into Tibet in the middle of winter, very ill-equipped. I didn't have, I was wearing Wellington boots, rubber boots, so that wasn't ideal. The temperatures were down in the minus 30s Celsius, so that's similar in Fahrenheit, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And I was extremely cold each night. I was in my tent for 15 or 16 hours a night, just shivering. I didn't have enough food. I wasn't allowed to be in Tibet. I had sort of snuck in illegally, so I struggled to get more food. So I lost sort of dangerous amounts of weight. And I really, really suffered. I got quite badly lost in one particular blizzard, and to the point where I thought I was going to die. That was a sort of a wake-up call, I guess. It genuinely scared. It was the first time in my life, I think, that I confronted and actually contemplated my own mortality and envisaged dying up there on the Tibetan plateau and being found, several years later, just this bleached pile of bones somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. And it scared me, and but I think crucially, it didn't scare me from doing things like that again. It scared me into making sure I did them a little better next time. So when that journey was finished, and I looked back at the 4 years, and I started thinking, well, what would I like to do for the next journey? The answer was very immediate and very obvious to me. I want to go somewhere cold. I want to go somewhere colder, and I want to do it better. I want to, rather than survive, I'd like to try and thrive. And so I went to Arctic Russia. This is about 10 years ago, and sort of did a journey up there that went better. And with every subsequent journey,
That's good.
I've sort of been a little less scared.
What was I going to say? When I think on, it's giving. This is what I was thinking. It's giving the respect that the activity deserves. It's just being respectful and not assuming we just know everything. And as we've said, things are going to go sideways, but just give it the respect that it deserves. One of the I had written this down because I had thought about it, because this story really stood out to me. And correct me if I'm wrong in any of the details, but and feel free to dive deep into it. But I remember you biking through Central Africa on that journey, and I believe it was at night, and you were going, and you come upon a village, and people see you and they basically just start swarming you. And you're able to get away. What was that experience like? I mean, that really stood out to me to say, holy smokes, this is very real.
Yeah. That's another experience that genuinely scared me. Thankfully, I was with a friend when it happened. We were in the southwest of DRC, and DRC had been quite an intimidating place to visit. It's somewhere where historically nothing's really gone right. And in the brief window where it might have started to go right, the Belgians and the CIA stepped in and murdered the prime minister. Mm-hmm. So it's a country that's not really stood much of a chance. It suffers from having enormous reserves of resources, which is the resource curse, as many people call it. So diamonds and gold and copper and various rare earth metals, and uranium. And we'd been quite intimidated before visiting, but we entered the country in the southeast and slowly started crossing the southwest of the country by bicycle. And we found everyone extremely friendly, very happy to chat to us. We met interesting people, Belgian missionaries sort of off in remote areas there from a sort of, decades old sort of project. And we as a rule of thumb, we always made sure we camped before dark. In much of the world, but more so in parts of the world that don't have much by the way of electric lighting, in areas that have histories of banditry or tribal warfare. The nighttime, you hunker down. You don't want to come upon anyone. You don't want to surprise anyone at night. There's an anonymity to the darkness as well, which perhaps doesn't help. Anyway, we pitched camp in the forest one night. It's really in the middle of nowhere, but these men found us as we were pitching camp, and they were very drunk and quite abrasive. And they started saying, "This is our land. You must give us hundreds of dollars to camp here for the night." And so we waited a little while to see if they would leave us alone, but they clearly weren't going to. So we packed up and we moved on, but night was falling by that point. And we sort of unexpectedly arrived in a village, and we were cycling. It was dark on this sandy, uneven track, and we just kept going. We thought best just to get through the village. It's not good to arrive in a village, and we also didn't want to attract attention that would involve us being followed, and the attention. It's hard to slip away, and you're cautious on these fronts in places like Central Africa. But after a short while, someone spotted us and shouted something. The village was a long village stretched along this track, kind of a single line of houses, it seemed, with people sitting outside the front around little fires. I think we went unnoticed for a bit, but then people saw us and someone shouted something, and suddenly just the entire community, maybe they shouted bandit or thief or who knows, the entire community just sort of mobilized and charged us. And people were throwing sticks at us, throwing shoes at us, throwing punches at us, trying to hit us. People were trying to stick sticks in the spokes of our wheels. And it was dark. The road was uneven. I couldn't see. When I was behind my friend, and I shouted. He wouldn't be able to see me, so I was just trying to keep a constant line of communication. Just keep going. Just keep going. I'm still here. Just keep going. And the worry was, if I got caught and he got away, then he would be forced to make this terrible decision. What do I do? We never really want to find out what we do in those situations, because it'd be very natural to be so terrified you just keep going. And I genuinely think that if we had been caught, if we hadn't managed to make it out of the village, there's a good chance. I've seen mob mentality before. I've seen people beaten to a pulp in markets when they're suspected of pickpocketing. I genuinely think there's a chance that torn limb from limb is over dramatic, but we might have got ourselves very, very badly physically beaten and injured. Thankfully, we did manage to dodge various people and make it out the other side of the village. And we fled we could hear people chasing us. Motorbikes started up. We ducked off the road after a little while and hid in the forest. and spent this very, very fretful night in the forest while motorbikes went up and down the road, the track nearby, with dogs as well, presumably searching for us. That was really, really frightening. But I also think that if the next morning we'd gone to the track and then just walked or cycled back into the village under daylight, everything would have been absolutely fine. We didn't do that. It didn't seem useful or necessary. So we carried on and we just sort of got out of the way. And we both felt really shaken by the experience. But I do think that was due to it being night rather than people, frankly.
How did you process that? You're in the middle of Central Africa. You still have a journey to go. You just went through this terribly frightening experience, but you still have to go on. Was it a dialogue that you two had together, or did you have that dialogue in your mind, or what
we spoke quite a lot about it, and we contemplated how we might have gone wrong, what we could have done differently. Probably the best thing to do would have been to stop at the very first house we encountered in the village, put our bikes down, go over, introduce ourselves, and then be accompanied by someone and walk further on into the village, find the chief, introduce ourselves, ask for permission to camp in the middle of the village that night, or whatever it might be. It's just something that didn't really cross our minds in our sort of fatigue after a long day of cycling, our eagerness to just find somewhere peaceful and be alone and go to sleep, and our sort of maybe exhaustion with being constantly observed and followed. And if you camp in a community, you don't get any privacy and you don't get much sleep, frankly, and you have people surrounding you the entire time, which is understandable and not a problem, but it can be wearing. So we spoke about that a lot. I think as I've mentioned, it definitely helped that I was not alone when that happened. There was a night about a year earlier in Ethiopia where I was beaten up quite badly by a village mob at night. It's a similar sort of situation, really. And that I found a lot harder to process, because the next day I managed to get away. I managed to find somewhere hidden to camp that night after being physically beaten up quite badly. And I woke up the next day cut and bruised and sort of lonely. And I was just there in a tent by myself, and I got back on the road, and for some reason Ethiopia is a hard place to cycle through. You get pelted with stones a lot. It's a country that's, among places I've cycled, actually quite unique for its antagonism towards cyclists. I don't know why. Once you get off the bike, people are very nice and normal. I think in DRC I was with someone else, and that made it a lot easier to process and rationalize what had happened, and hopefully learn a thing or two from it.
Well, absolutely. I can't imagine, but that that was one of those stories that I was like, I need to ask him about that. You mentioned being alone and processing these things that were scary. I know this is going to sound I don't know, juvenile or out of left field, but I think it is really interesting. It was like, as a kid, being afraid of the dark, right? Or being afraid of ghosts, or being afraid of these, nature. If you're camping by yourself at night, did you have any fear, or to me, I think of all the scary stories, you hear on podcasts and paranormal things happening outside. Did that fear ever come into you, or are you kind of a naturalist? That stuff doesn't really exist anyway. It's fine. I just have to be fearful of the gorilla and the lion.
It's an interesting question. I think the latter. I think by the time I started doing these things, I was already, I'd grown up a little bit. I'm quite a rationalist, I suppose. And I mean, fear of the dark is very natural. We should be afraid of the dark because we don't know what's in it. Whether that's an upturned piece of Lego in the house for some people, or a pin or a bit of broken glass, or whether that is, dangerous animals or whatever. I suppose rational fear is fine. And I try to avoid irrational fear. And I don't experience it often, but occasionally I do catch myself with an irrational fear, which is very common. And actually you see it in all sorts of parts of life. A lot of people have irrational fears that are stoked by, an easy, obvious example, irrational fears of outsiders, that are stoked by various, let's say, media interests or political interests. Other people will have irrational fears of, loneliness, or there's all sorts of things. But whenever I catch myself with an irrational fear, once you notice that it's irrational, understand it's irrational, the fear dissipates entirely, because once you've rationalized, you can no longer have that. So yeah, I've not really struggled with sort of a fear of the paranormal or anything along those lines. There are sometimes occasions where you experience something and you really struggle to explain it. Mm-hmm. But my default there is I don't have all the information, rather than this must be aliens built the pyramids, let's say.
Yeah. Is there any moment or time that struck you, or that sticks with you, that something that happened that was unexplainable, and you go, there's that really stuck with you?
I'd have to think about that. I mean, I was about to say, there are coincidences that have occurred when I'm traveling that feel unexplainable until you understand that coincidences mathematically happen, and it would be unexplainable if they never did. So I'll kind of discount that. I'm not sure if there have been. I feel like there must be, but not that I can summon immediately, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no worries. I always think of, humanity on a curve, right? And there are billions of us, and there are people on that curve that show, abilities or talents or physicality that is way, way, way far on the edge of that curve. Were there any experiences where you encountered someone that was unlike any other that you've ever encountered?
Once again, I feel like there must have been. From a physical perspective, I think experimenting with and exploring the limits of possibility on that front is a occupation of, generally speaking, is an occupation of privileged societies. Because we have the time and the means and the recreational time to do these things. We are not laden with, it's not a very pleasant term, but the drudgery of physical labor and various things just to get by, get through the day, to feed ourselves or provide for our families or whatever that might be. That said, something that astonishes me just in general, but I have also met a couple of runners in Kenya, is the extraordinary phenomenon that is East African distance runners, generally living in areas of altitude. And it's sort of become, I think it was astonishing in the first place, but now it's become such a prestige occupation to be a successful marathon runner in, let's say, Ethiopia or Kenya, that it's no longer surprising. It's still incredible that you had, for example, someone earlier this year run a marathon in less than 2 hours. In fact, 2 people run the marathon in less than 2 hours, the second of whom was running his first ever marathon, which is sort of hard to comprehend. But that has now become a status thing in these countries. So frankly, the biggest celebrities, at least in sports, but perhaps in general in, let's say, Kenya, are marathon runners, and they are huge stars, and they are rightly, remunerated very well and have comfortable lives. So it's become a very aspirational thing, and now it does make more sense, and that only fuels the kind of the upward cycle of more and more people getting into this with the dream of becoming, this phenomenon. So that's something that springs to mind. But it's a slightly more general thing than individuals that I've particularly personally encountered, I guess.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know we are coming up on our, on the end of this, and one of the things I wanted to ask though before we ended, and I want to talk to briefly about what you want your legacy to be as you look forward through life. But the thing that I didn't want to miss though was this idea, was your time in Russia, being in a very much a police state, being in a time where misinformation was not only a part of the environment that you were in, but necessary for the state in order to, continue what they are, the special operation, right? How has that made you reflect on police states in and of themselves, or what our governments are, how they are approaching society? Does it make you nervous? Do you feel like it's not even on the same plane? Or how should we look at that for our own lives from what you've experienced?
I suppose, to be tidy, I think I can link the two strands of question together before I delve more into that
Sure.
secondary point. The legacy, I think the only thing that I'm really fussed about from a legacy perspective and is leaving behind a body of work that is enjoyable and helpful or useful. I've only written 3 books now, but I'm sure there'll be more. One of the great joys of my life has been reading books, and in particular travel literature, but not exclusively, and leaving behind something. We now live in an age where, if you write something, frankly, if you just put something on Twitter, people will be able to dissect that and think about it potentially thousands of years from now, which is fairly remarkable. But I like the idea of leaving behind a body of work, of written work, that will interest and entertain people, but more importantly will help people understand other parts of the world. And with my latest book, On Thin Ice, what have I got here? An explorer's memoir of Siberia surveillance and survival. I think that anyone who reads that will close the book upon finishing it with a deeper understanding of Russia and how Russia got to where it is, and what Russian people think, and what they might think but don't feel free or able to say, and the bind that many, arguably most Russian people find themselves in this country, which is increasingly authoritarian and extremely autocratic, where they are not free to say what they think. They're not free to access the truth. So what I think, to come back to the sort of end of your question, what I think today about, or what that experience in Russia has taught me about autocracy or authoritarianism is, and maybe Russia isn't the best example for this, because Russia is a country that is, as Vasily Grossman once wrote, in 1,000 years, Russia has had everything. The one thing Russia has not had is freedom. Russia has never really been a truly open and democratic and free society. There have been brief windows of difference and change, but they have tended to veer in troubling directions. But it's the slippery slope, I suppose, is what I've learnt. And maybe I learnt this more just from doing high school history and learning about Germany in the 1930s, and seeing how a functioning democratic country, if it gets fed pernicious ideas, if it decides to, or if certain actors decide to blame or frankly scapegoat certain individuals, in the case in Germany in the 1930s, the Jewish people, then things can take very, very worrying turns, even in democratic society where Hitler was elected. I'm not a massive fan of some of the more authoritarian, less democratic and frankly less rational tendencies of some world leaders these days. Mm-hmm. But even if they are democratically elected, I think having a democratic mandate is increasingly seen as an excuse to do whatever the hell you want, as opposed to continuing to... If we allow the organs of state to wither, they will, because there are enough vested interests in the withering of the organs of state and in the withering of the checks and balances, the systems that are put in place to maintain a fair society, a free and fair society. So even countries that staunchly pride themselves on freedom can become less and less and less free and more prone to their own worse instincts or the worst elements of their nature. I'm speaking increasingly obviously here, aren't I? Yeah, but I think Russia is a cautionary tale.
No, so many good points there. The withering, great word for it, because it's a little by little, over time, in almost a way that you don't see it.
Boiling frogs.
Yes, boiling frogs. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that we could probably chat for many, many hours on so many different topics and a lot of stones left unturned. But I really appreciate you, Charlie, jumping on and chatting today. Where can people find you, follow you, learn more about what your next adventure is going to be like?
The easiest place to sort of follow me for updates and photos and stuff like that from different journeys is my Instagram account, which is at CW Explore. My website is cwexplore.com. My books are widely available online, Kindle, Audible, bookshops. It might be a little harder in the US, but they are available. Yeah, those are the places to find me.
Yep. For all those in the US, Amazon has it. So definitely check it out there. But Charlie, thank you again so much. Super appreciate you taking the time. This was a fantastic conversation. And best of luck on the next adventure. Do you have anything that is on top of mind that you're aiming for next?
I've got some tentative plans for the beginning of next year, but I'm going to keep them to myself just for now, because nothing's fixed yet, and it depends on a few things. So watch this space, I suppose. And it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having me, Eric.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one. All right, we'll all look out for that the beginning of the next year. Bye-bye now.
Cheers.